All right, so let's get started. So this is what we'll be covering tonight. We'll be starting with hearing from Dr. Mark Schellenberg on the practical applications of forage rejuvenation. We'll open it up to some questions for you, and then we'll end with some closing remarks and where you can find a bit more information on the topic. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Dr. Schellenberg. So Dr. Schellenberg is a range and forage plant ecologist at Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada in Swift Current. He has conducted and directed forage plant ecology research since 1996. His work is focused on improving knowledge of introduced and native plant communities through the development of simplified plant communities to improve economically, environmentally, and nutritionally sustainable forage resources for the livestock industry. So with that, take it away, Mike. We can't hear you, Mike.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. There you go.
Okay. Well, thank you for joining. I am going to be speaking on the rejuvenation of forage stands and some things to consider. Hopefully that you will be able to find something of interest to you in this presentation. And I find it quite interesting that at the beginning of this week, I received my CFGA winter edition quarterly newsletter, and they have two quotes here that I think actually fit the sort of the discussion of the evening, and I'll just read them off here. When surveyed, producers indicate that they keep their pastures in anywhere from 5 years to forever. And the interesting part about that particular quote is the word forever, because I think when we finish this presentation, you may want to redefine what that forever means. And then the second quote from BCRC includes, while we dream of permanent tame grass that produces good yields indefinitely, the reality is that forage stands decline in productivity over time and periodically need rejuvenation to be productive. Therefore, forage establishment needs to be a regular tool used on the farm or ranch. And what we have this evening will hopefully take and provide you some of that information and maybe generate some thoughts as to how you may want to look at your own operations. So, okay, here. So what I'm going to try and cover here, first off, is we're going to take and go over where the research was located, because that will have an impact as to how that data has been interpreted in the production of this presentation, and there will probably need to be some adjustment for where you are located as to how you use the information. We'll also give you a quick definition on what rejuvenation is, and then we'll give you some reasons to consider why you may want to take and do rejuvenation, and then we'll go through what needs to be accomplished for successful rejuvenation, and then as well as possible ways to rejuvenate, and then we'll take and end with a summary of some of the things I hope to have gotten across during the presentation itself. So, location, well, I'm talking to you actually from Swift Current, Saskatchewan, which is in Saskatchewan, which is the center of the prairies. I'm in the southwest portion of the province, which is a semi-arid region, which means we get about 13 inches or 350 milliliters of precipitation per year. It's fairly dry. If you're looking at the map that's on the screen, what you will see is that it's also located in a region with a good amount of livestock production, mainly beef cattle, and it's also associated with some of the last remaining endangered habitat known as prairie, actual native prairie. And then you see that on the map is highlighted again as a high percentage of livestock production, but that also associated with native grasslands. It's also one of the reasons where we are just an hour north of the Grasslands National Park, because that's some of the most contiguous grassland still in existence. The other thing to note on the map is that purple dashed line that kind of goes from the west corner of Manitoba over towards the western corner just below Lethbridge. That's roughly what is known as the Palliser Triangle. And if there are any history buffs in the audience, you will recognize that as well, the explorer Palliser went through the region. When he went through the region, his description of the area was desert, definitely not for human habitat. The interesting thing is that this area has now become one of the key components in annual crop as well as livestock production over the years. Obviously, Palliser had gone through the area in one of the extreme droughts, and again, emphasizing that dry climate. So a lot of the things we've done, we've developed techniques to deal with that dry climate. I guess the other thing I will add is that dry climate is or has been predicted by a number of models to be the future environment that will be found in the future. So, what exactly is pasture rejuvenation? Well, it is considered the act of bringing new vigor or usefulness to a pasture. And by pasture here, we're referring to seeded pasture, often with introduced species. Now, restoration is something a little different. It can include that rejuvenation or have the result of rejuvenation, but it really involves returning to its original state, some plant community in this case, and that is often what we refer to as what we would use in our native grasslands. And some of the techniques that we use in rejuvenation can be used for restoration, for reintroducing species. Now, we do not want to take, in my mind, because it is an endangered habitat, it's a rare commodity, we don't want to be out there breaking large amounts of native grassland to take and revigorate, increase its vigor. We really want to preserve that. But, as I said, the restoration or the rejuvenation techniques can be used in restoration to take and introduce species that may have gone missing in those native grasslands that may have been originally there. Now, the things to consider in rejuvenation, there's a number of things to consider. This particular diagram emphasizes 4 things that are actually overlapping and actually can occur all at the same time or by themselves. Going around the circle, starting with disturbance, well, rejuvenation typically will require some type of disturbance to achieve the objective. And that disturbance can result in the possibility of introduction of invasive species, which are also influenced by the climate or the weather that is happening, as in, let's say you run into a number of dry years. Well, that disturbance then becomes a huge risk factor, and also increases the possibility of invasive species. But if you get a wet year, that disturbance can have a positive effect, and you have that introduction of the desired species and potentially a controlling of those invasive species. And then we have the whole greenhouse gas represented by the CO2 component, and that can play an important part in how species continue or in the stand, and also how those species may be selected. And again, we have an interaction here with the invasive species. These invasive species have been noted as increasing under that greenhouse gas scenarios. But we also have, when we're doing our selection for the species we may be wanting to introduce as part of the rejuvenation, such as the cool season or C3 grass types, they are actually noted as having a positive response to increased CO2, as opposed to maybe species which would be warm seasons of the C4s. And the main reason is that part of the CO2 scenario comes with that weather change, where we're going to be seeing potentially more grouping of precipitation, and that will the suggested patterns would say an intensification in the spring period And the C3s are active at that time. It's cooler temperatures, and they're actively capturing those resources. And by the time it gets warm enough for the warm seasons to become active, a major portion of those resources are captured by the cool season grasses, and the warm seasons just are not able to compete to the same level. So again, what we have here is an interaction of four components that must be considered when thinking through or planning a possible rejuvenation. Now, things to consider within the rejuvenation would include, your low productivity, and productivity has dropped. We'll go through some, in a few slides, we'll go through some of the reasons why you might have a lower productivity. We also may be missing a plant species has gone missing due to management or management decisions or basically efforts to take and improve stands, but as a result we've lost some of the species that we really wanted to keep. We also have to look at poor soil fertility, and typically here we're talking about the decrease in nitrogen or phosphorus. And along with that comes the type of soil. Again, we start thinking about light soils which become more erodables if we were to take and do a fairly extensive disturbance, or we have some heavy clays which prevent or slow down the penetration of roots from the plant species themselves. And of course, all these come with production risks, and some of these are more risky than others. And by risks, we often look at, especially in the southwest Saskatchewan where I work, and we've done the work, we're looking at, will we actually get our stand establishment, and we may be looking at a year or 2 years without any growth, which then I guess increases that economic risk to the operation itself. So are there ways to take and maybe mitigate some of these risks? So, low productivity. As we remember that very first quote, pastures are to be from 5 years to forever. Well, in Swift Current and actually from data from elsewhere in the country, we know that we get that once you've seeded your stand, you get that increasing productivity up until the 4 or 5 year period. Excuse me. And after that 4 to 5 year period, we see a fairly sharp drop in productivity. And this is going to go, as we see in this map, from actual data taken at Swift Current. Monocultures and mixtures seem to follow the same pattern. Actually, in this case, they do. So the explanation for that drop in productivity is initially you've got with seedlings a fairly wide open resource area, and as they develop, the roots start to explore the soil around them, and in about that 4 to 5 years, they fully explore the available soil and are now in competition with the neighboring plants, which again results or can result or does result in drop productivity. And with that low productivity, we also see species selection. Now, there has been an argument for quite a while that natives aren't as good as introduced species. Well, in Swift Current, we've done some comparisons, and we're looking at this graph where we have green eelgrass and western wheatgrass, which are natives. We also have Russian wild rye and cress wheatgrass, which are sort of the main introduced species in the more arid, semi-arid regions of the Saskatchewan. And we see actually that there is not a lot of difference between the natives and the introduced species. We also have a warm season grass here, the switchgrass. On this particular study, the switchgrass, when this data was taken, was still there, but within 3 years it had died off, and that was primarily due to the fact that we had cool, wet springs. And again, our cool season grasses are able to take advantage of that, whereas the warm seasons, by the time the switchgrass was actively growing, that moisture had been taken up by the cool seasons, and eventually the switchgrass actually just disappeared from the stands. The key thing to note here is the mixtures. The mixtures, by having a mixture, we're actually seeing some fairly significant increase in productivity, which is why we tend to take and recommend that that you should be looking at mixtures as opposed to monocultures. Now, this recommendation does change to some extent if you're looking at hay or grazing. Haying, you may want to take and stick to a single species because you're looking at haying at specific time and you're looking for a specific quality, whereas mixtures, you'll have a bit of a mixed bag. But for grazing, mixtures provide some benefits. So what we're really talking about here with mixtures is diversification. What we have here is a picture of from the Qu'Appelle Valley in Saskatchewan. And from looking at the picture, you can see that there are different groupings of vegetation based on what is on the landscape. And this is kind of a typical landscape that I work in, doing range work. It's a rolling topography, and with that rolling topography, you have microsites that are more conducive to certain species. For instance, in this picture, you can see the wetter areas are occupied by trees and shrubs, and the grasses tend to be, looking at them, a bit of a brome species, whereas the drier areas, we start to see things like wheatgrass, such as what we see in the foreground, and up in the upper slopes, we may be looking at blue grama. The key thing here is not necessarily the species I mentioned, but the fact that we have species that are adapted to certain microsites on the landscape. So by providing a mixture, you're able to take, potentially, if you've picked the right species in the mixture, you have picked species that can basically occupy different microsites and be more productive than, say, a monoculture, which is not necessarily adapted to all sites. And with that goes that species selection. What do you want to take and select? Here we did a study where we were trying to take and diversify crested wheatgrass stands. Crested wheatgrass being one of the more common grasses that has been seeded on the prairies. In fact, it is considered the sort of savior of the prairies from the 1930s. It was seeded extensively. So we have stands, roughly over 1 million acres of crested wheatgrass, stands that are probably in that, 80-year-old. They've been in existence or present for 80 years without any disturbance. So there's an interest in diversifying. So we're looking at here a swift current site where western wheatgrass is the one that seems to be the best selection. But if we go a mere hour to the south in the Grasslands National Park with a crested wheatgrass stand of a similar age, we find that the prairie sandreed is actually the better grass to be selected for that particular site. The point of the slide here is that you need to take and be aware of what your site is. Just because somebody an hour away may be using something doesn't necessarily mean that it's the correct species for you. So that you have to, there has to be some consideration in that species selection for your particular operation. And speaking of selecting species, well, when you select your species, one of the things, because this is to be used as forage, livestock will be utilizing these to take and meet their nutritional needs. This particular slide is digestible protein. It's from Cook, 1972, and the reason I'm using it, it gives you a nice explanation or a nice picture of what happens as grasses or forbs being some things like legumes or shrubs such as winterfat or saltbush, mature. And what we find, and the black line, by the way, at the just above, that's about 4.25% protein, is what's considered the maintenance level for steers. And what we find is that as grasses mature, and once they reach the flowering state or anthesis, they tend to take and drop off or lose their protein quite rapidly. whereas the forbs are sort of in that middle ground. They hold out to just beyond the fruiting for the digestible protein, whereas the shrubs actually maintain their digestible protein well into maturity. And we see this with species such as winter fat, where we have measured in winter an 18% crude protein value, where the grasses such as northern wheatgrass has been measured at something like 2%. And again, these lines are averages of a number of species and not just a single species. So you do have some variation with species that you could maybe start looking at as well. That's a crude protein. As we know, in the wintertime and the fall periods, we tend to be looking at protein in stands is a bit of an issue, as in it's usually the ingredient that is missing in the nutritional package. But if we look at our digestible energy, we actually see a flip of what we had in the previous slide, where our grasses are actually maintaining digestible energy availability better than our shrubs. And again, our forbs, such as the legumes, are kind of in that middle ground. And again, just to sort of re-emphasize that fact that combinations of species can give you a benefit. And for quite a while now, the standard recommendation has been, when seeding, is to include an alfalfa to take and boost your productivity. Here we're looking at something a little different. We're looking at shrubs and alfalfa, but the message is pretty much the same. When you have those combinations, we can actually see benefits of having the combinations of the shrub and alfalfa. We have similar information with grasses and alfalfa as well, where we get those benefits. So the key here is diversification is good. It actually can provide you some of that nutritional benefits within your stands, as well as increased productivity. As I said, we've been recommending for a while, legumes is what you want, what you should consider putting in. Now, the benefits of the legumes are that they fix nitrogen, which gives you that biological, and that will be there for a number of years as opposed to a one-time application per se. And also alfalfa is one of the more popular ones, or is probably the most popular legume that is seeded in forage stands. And alfalfa has been known to take and increase forage production by 100% with an accompanying increase in livestock production. And of course, as I identified in the previous slide, it's also a good source of protein. Now, what I've gotten here on the side are a number of different species that we've been using that are of interest. We have the purple prairie clover and the white prairie clover, which have some fairly unique tannins, but they're also what we would call a warm season legume, as in they seem to take and become they go through their maturing state in that August to September period, so they come in late, and for us in the West, that means we have a potential legume that will get us through that slump period and providing protein when the cooler season legumes are maybe going dormant. And of course we have the alfalfa. That's the yellow blossom alfalfa developed at Swift Current here. We also have another native Canadian milkvetch, and then we have sweetvetch, which we're working on as well. And of course, there's also the option of Seister milkvetch, pictured here. And the Seister milkvetch itself, we have found tends to work in the moisture, higher moisture areas in the province, or even it does work somewhat in southern Saskatchewan, but you need to have that moisture present. If you have a fairly dry landscape, it doesn't do as well. As I said, we've been studying the legume benefit, and recently we ran a study, in fact, it's 2 years ago, where we looked at combinations of grasses and legumes. We had 2 legumes, alfalfa and purple prairie clover. Then we had western wheatgrass and green needlegrass. We had them in combinations. And what we see in the table is basically just what happens when you have a legume or a grass. The combinations typically came in between, but what we noted of interest was the fact that having two legumes actually outproduced everything, including the grasses, even in the two, significantly more than the two grasses together. So having the two legumes. Now this may have been because of the choice we made, where we had that cool season alfalfa, and then we had that later season purple prairie clover. The purple prairie clover, I will say, did not contribute a huge amount to the mix, but the fact that the combination actually did outproduce just having a single legume. The grasses themselves, again, having two grasses did perform better than just a single grass. The key message here is maybe we need to start thinking about having more than just a single legume in our stands. And when we're doing the rejuvenation, it might be worthwhile to take and include two legumes as opposed to one. And with the diversification, up to now, we've been sort of concentrating on that above ground component. But with that diversification, we also find we have a diversification below the soil surface. And on this particular picture, which is obtained from the internet, we see smooth brome, which is a very common grass, has a fairly shallow root, as does the Kentucky bluegrass. But if we were to have other species such as little blue stem, which we do use in swift current, and has a much deeper rooting system. And if we start adding some of the forbs, such as alfalfa or even the prairie clovers, we find they have a different rooting pattern, but they also have the ability to go quite a bit deeper than the grasses do. So we're now accessing more of the resources in that soil profile. And we've also shown through a number of studies looking at the microbial communities that are associated with plants, that having a mixture actually improves or increases that diversity, which gives you a healthier microbial community as well, which in turn results in a healthier plant stand as well. So again, having those multiple species have benefits beyond just the production. We're also seeing improvement in soil quality, and as well as the health of the plants themselves. We'll also note that we, in 2015, one of the worst drought records we had in the 126-year record at Swift Current, the stands where we had mixtures, we were able to see some of these deep-rooted grasses actually perform. We saw no drop in productivity with the little blue stem that we had in the plots, and as well as the western wheatgrass seemed to do quite well as well, as opposed to some of the others with the shallower root systems. Now, so what are the possibilities for rejuvenation? Well, there's a number of them. I provide a list, and this is maybe not totally comprehensive, but it gives you it's the more common and broadly used ones. Grazing management, just manipulating how grazing occurs can allow you to take and change the plant community dynamics and the access to the plants themselves. Burning is often used as a tool to take and remove undesirable species, or to take and get rid of areas that maybe have excess dead material. In this case, the picture here, we're actually removing shrub material to take and allow the grasses to come through. Mowing, again, can be used to take and remove some of the weedier species that may not be wanted. We also have mechanical soil disturbance, where you can remove a portion of the plant stand or completely remove all plant and do some reseeding. Fertilization, that would be basically application of fertilizers such as nitrogens and phosphorus to take and boost that productivity, sort of get to take and make more of those nutrients available to the plants themselves to take and to increase their productivity. And again, herbicides can be used to eliminate undesirable species, but they can also be utilized to take and create a seed bed, which we would then go in with sod seeding, where we seed directly into the sod, as we see in this picture here. Now, the other one, another fairly simple technique for increasing productivity in an area where moisture can be an issue, is to put in a windbreak. On the landscape these days, we see a lot of removal of the shrubby windbreaks, but those are not the only option you have. You can put in a tall species, or even cut, if you're doing hay, you can cut leaves standing a row or 2 rows in the field to take and create, shall we say, a living windbreak. And the advantage of the windbreaks is not just the fact that they catch snow, but they also decrease the evapotranspiration, basically evaporation from the plants. Therefore, you do not get that loss of moisture from the plants themselves. You're actually decreasing that, and as a result, you get an increase in productivity within the stands. While looking at management, I thought it would be worthwhile to take and at least give you an example of sort of the time of grazing. The first thing with the grazing, I will say, when we've done the work here, it's not a single year response. It takes a number of years of that particular management to take a plant community in one direction or another. In this case, we're looking at crested wheatgrass. And in this case, we're trying to take and determine what the time of grazing within the year might be to take and restrict the growth of crested wheatgrass. Because again, even though it has been used as an agronomic species, in some situations it is also known as an invasive species or an undesirable species where it moves in and sort of takes over. So what we're looking at here is where we've grazed for 5 years in a row at the same time, May, or June, August, or September. And these are all different pastures that are grazed at those specific times. And what we see is if we take and hit the crested wheatgrass in that May, we're actually able to take and restrict that spread. What this means from a management perspective is that, if you wanted to increase, you would be grazing your crested wheatgrass at a later time. Basically, you've allowed that seed set to occur and the distribution of seed. And this is, again, comes into play with a number of other species as well. And that timing of grazing to allow seed set can increase that presence of the particular plant. In fact, we have a study here where we seeded a number of native species, and we found that the timing of the grazing, really, we could take and go from a large mixture of species to almost a monoculture of little bluestem, for instance, by grazing late and allowing that particular plant to take and expand its presence. So anyways, so grazing, timing of grazing, the number of animals grazing will also affect the makeup of your plant communities. We have the opportunity in the late 90s to take and look at a number of techniques for rejuvenation and did a comparison. A lot of this work is based on work that was done by John Waddington, Gary Bowes, and Dwayne McCartney. But anyways, and they've showed they have a number of papers showing a number of different techniques. But in this particular opportunity, we were able to take and compare. And what we did was apply 100 pounds per acre of nitrogen or 100 kilos per hectare of nitrogen to a particular field. And we also did spiking, where we removed using a knife cultivator to take and remove 50% of the stand, and then we seeded some alfalfa into that very lumpy field. And then we also went in and as a different treatment where we sprayed glyphosate and then seeded alfalfa or sod seeded alfalfa into those strips. And then we also had as a comparison what I would call sort of a traditional approach, where we basically break the pasture, basically with the intent of removing all the vegetation or killing all the vegetation and then reseeding a new stand in place. And what we see here on just on the dry matter basis is, yeah, we do get that big effect with the fertilizer, but it drops off rapidly without an application. So that first year is when you get your big bang, and then it starts to drop off. The spiking is a bit of a mixed message. We do see an increase in 97, but to some extent that is also attributed to maybe a slightly wetter year than the previous years. But what we did notice is the alfalfa in the spike didn't come through that strong because the plants were still competing with plants that were fully active and fully grown. Whereas with the sprayed, we actually see an overall a better productivity looking at all 3 years combined. And of course, the cultivated is probably the more traditional, is probably the higher risk option, because first off, we lose that first year of productivity, and then we have that stand as it's slowly developing, so you don't necessarily get a lot of productivity off those seedlings the first year, and you usually tend to graze those lightly, and it's the third year that you really see this get to see the production. So, and in our area, we got lucky. We actually got a stand establishment after seeding the first year, and we don't necessarily see that if we're in a dry cycle, where we may have to wait a few years before we actually see a stand. We also had the opportunity in the same study to take a look at some of the average daily gains. And here we're looking at and what we see here with the fertilizer is we sort of, we maintain some productivity. And then as then we go to the spike, we see a little less productivity, and then with the herbicide, with glyphosate and sod seeding in alfalfa, we actually see a fairly good improvement in that. We're looking at 96 and 97, so that's the last 2 years of the 3-year study. And again, the cultivated, we see that basically no production or very little production 96 with 97. So again, we've lost that 2 years of potential gains on the animals. So looking at this, there seems to be a message here that maybe there is a place to take or a place for that herbicide sod seeding, which gives us maybe a reduced risk, because we're not looking at sort of a lost production because we've broken the land, and we also have that the fact that we're now putting that seed into areas where it's not competing directly with portions of existing stands, so we get better, in this case, alfalfa establishment. Now, how to get that seed there? There's a number of different seeders that have been used. The one in our area that was the most effective was a double disc range seeder, where we have a fairly large coal tar disc in the front that cuts the sod, and we have a sort of an offset disc, and then that places the seed, and then followed by packers behind that then pack that seed row where the seed is now located. We have a number of others that we looked at, which had various wing type openers. We also looked at airways, which basically roughed or disturbed the soil. This one we did find did not work well in the drier regions. You needed moisture. It worked well in Saskatchewan or Canada, if you're fortunate enough to have rain occur after you've done worked up or done the disturbance. Further north, it worked much better. And again, this it's moisture is a factor in establishing, and it becomes, as I said previously, is definitely a limiting factor in trying to get things done, established in a drier environment. So really with the seeders, what we're trying to, with the rejuvenation and the seeders, we're trying to create what was called a safe site for those seedlings. You're looking for something where the seedlings have reduced competition for nutrients, including water. They're not in direct competition with each other, and they're not in direct competition with plants that are fully established. You're also looking for sites where there is some conservation of moisture, so they have access to the moisture. And with a safe site, you can also start looking at the time of when you place that seed. In some situations, maybe it would be more appropriate to take and maybe seed in fall. And some species respond better with a fall seeding. And then you'll be taking advantage of that early spring moisture as opposed to doing it in spring and potentially moving into that drier period before the seedlings are fully able to adapt to that drier environment. So what we're trying to do with the rejuvenation and with the seeders is create those safe sites for those seedlings to take and develop and become productive. Here's a study that, looking at the numbers, it's fairly obvious what worked. Again, we have the Swift Current site, then we have the Grasslands National Park site. We have where we did no disturbance at all, and we got no establishment. We tried a dicot, which basically burned off using a herbicide that basically suppressed the above ground growth for 1 year. Again, but that we got no establishment. That's due in large part to the fact, even though you've removed that above ground, you still have all that active growth below ground in the roots that will basically still utilize those nutrients, and therefore taking those nutrients away and not making them available to the seedlings. We also have burns where we actually ran a fire across, and again, we did not get sufficient suppression of the existing stand to allow seedlings to establish. Grazing, in this case, we actually used mowing to simulate grazing. Again, we did not get sufficient suppression of the existing stands to take and provide that safe site for the seedlings to grow. Then we have the burn plus the graze, where we actually tried burning and then we mowed the resulting green flush after the burn. And again, we got insufficient suppression. Now, this is just a 1 year thing, as in we only did the treatment 1 year and then we waited to see what would happen afterwards. Excuse me. There are reports that grazing and burning combinations will work, but it will take multiple years to get the impact that you need to take and create those open spaces or safe sites for your seedlings to establish. Glyphosate provided that with a year application. We applied it, and then we came back roughly 10 days afterwards and did our seeding, and we got our establishment of our seedlings. So it would appear that the herbicide application has some benefits over some of the other disturbance effects that we utilize to try and establish plants in existing sods. Now this diagram itself is sort of key to the slide that follows. Now, and I'll take and walk you through it. What we're looking at here is basically a slot that is created by a seeder, and it places the seedling, or a seed I should say, in the bottom of that particular slot. Then we also have wings on those particular openers that undercut the sod. We have, in this case, we have different widths for that. Now, these slots, depending on the seeder, can usually go from about 2.5 centimeters, or roughly 1 inch, to 10 centimeters, which would be roughly, 4 inches. Okay, so you can get varying opening slots. Now, with the with a disc drill that we used, you don't get a slot. What you get is a cut in the sod. The seed is placed at the same depth, and then you get a pack that comes back over and seals that. Now, when we take a look at that in a dry environment, we see first off where you don't have any disturbance, as in you haven't done anything to set back the sod, as has been seen previously. You get no establishment of alfalfa in this case. Whereas the glyphosate with that disc seeder, we actually get establishment, actually fairly good establishment. But if we start looking at that 5 centimeter undercut, or 15 centimeter probably undercut, where we're cutting the roots, where we have 5 rows side by side, or we take and space them out a little more, and we have 3 rows, we're not getting the same response. In fact, we're not getting a really good response. And if we take and do a 35 centimeter, where we're cutting roots up to the 35 centimeters out, we're still not getting a response. And this is actually from a paper that's been published. The reason for this is the double disc with a glyphosate, by we're having the least amount of disturbance to that particular sod, and that sod is actually sealing the soil and allowing the moisture to remain. Whereas when we take and create the the slot, we're removing that seal above the soil, and we're actually seeing evaporation. We're getting moisture loss. In an environment where we're looking at semi-arid, that moisture becomes critical for seedling survival. Now, having said that, work done by Waddington and Bose does show that as you get moisture, higher moisture or higher precipitation, in Saskatchewan's case, as you move further north, that spacing and that need to preserve the soil cover becomes less important. In fact, we've been able to establish alfalfa without any disturbance by just simply going into the existing stand and placing the seed. And there's sufficient moisture there for that seedling to develop. Although I will say, by providing a zone there where there has to done some suppression, does get you a better stand faster of alfalfa. So, on the previous slides, we've seen that sod seeding actually seems to be the one, for our area anyways, is an option that seems to be working the best. It seems to be providing less risk, pardon me, just let me untie my tongue here. But what width do you actually need of that strip? Do you need to take and spray the entire field, or can we get away with just strips per se? And how wide do those strips need to be? So, in this particular study, we actually looked at a number of different widths. Again, this is at swift current, so we're operating in a semi-arid environment. And again, where we have no strips provided, we have no establishment of alfalfa, which is what we're using to take and revitalize the crested wheatgrass stands. And what we tend to find is that 50 centimeters, or roughly 2 feet width, and with placing the seed directly in the center is the best. Gives us the best establishment. Now, but we also, and that's based not just on the alfalfa, because the 75 gives you a little more alfalfa, but if you look at the weeds, we also get fewer weeds. And in the 75 centimeter, we found eventually these weeds actually overwhelm the alfalfa. The other thing to note, though, is even though that you sprayed out a strip, you still get a fairly good production of the adjacent crested wheatgrass. So if your seedlings don't come up that year, you still have some production available to take and utilize for grazing if that's what you want, or even haying. So you still have some productivity. In reality, you haven't really lost that much by spraying out the strips, and that is primarily because the crested wheatgrass along those strips is still able to take and access some of that moisture and some of the nitrogen that has been freed up from the decaying material, and then that goes into increased productivity of some of the crested wheatgrass plants along that sod.
Did you want to take a break here for some of the poll questions, Mike?
That would probably be good. Yep,
All
I
right.
can do that.
Okay, so just to let you guys know, what'll happen now is poll questions will appear on your screen. So you can click the answer that most applies to you. Your answers here are completely anonymous, so we're not able to attribute them to anything. So go ahead and you can start clicking your answers. I'll give you a couple seconds here. So our first question is, at what stand age should you consider forage rejuvenation on tame stands? So less than 4 years, 4 to 7 years, or greater than 7 years. All right. So some of the results here. So 5% of you said less than 4 years, 63% said 4 to 7 years, and 32% said greater than 7 years. So our next question here is, what are the barriers to you for rejuvenating forages? So is it knowledge, environment, economics, technology, or time? So you can once again choose the answer that most applies to you. Or I guess you can select any of the answers on this one that apply to you. So you can select more than one. All right. So we'll just close this here. What it looks like. All right. So about 30% of you said knowledge. And about 34, same that range, said the environment. 57% said the economics of it. Technology was 23%, and 41% said time was your barrier there. All right, so moving on to our next poll question. So what level of production loss would be required before rejuvenation was considered? So is it 50% or less, 50 to 60%, 60 to 70%, greater than 70%, or you wouldn't consider it at all? All right. So results for this one. So the majority, 39%, said 50% or less. About 33% said 50 to 60%. 20% was at 60 to 70%, and 99% of you guys said greater than 70%. All right. So just one more here right now. So what level of risk or production loss in a field over a 2-year period would you see as acceptable? So none, 50%, or 75%. So pick the one that best fits your answer. All right. So results for this one, it looks like about 63% of you, the good majority, say 50%. The most rest of you guys are around that 35% say none, and then 2% say 75% they're willing to risk. All right, so back to you, Mike.
Okay, so by now you should have a sense of what worked at Swift Current and what we tend to be recommending at the moment. Is basically that glyphosate herbicide at a 30% concentration, which is actually the quackgrass rate, is best to utilize. That ensures that you've killed your sward, and we're here talking specifically of a grass sward, or basically grass stand. We haven't done a lot of work with where we're going into, let's say, an alfalfa stand and trying to kill the alfalfa. It would take a different herbicide regime, I will say. We have tried. We have found that glyphosate isn't that effective, or as effective as we would like it to be on the alfalfa itself. We seem to get a fairly good proportion of the alfalfa existing when we've gone in with a glyphosate. Anyways, so within that dead strip, you need about 50 centimeter wide area for the southwest, as I indicated throughout the presentation thus far. As we go into the more moist areas, that safe zone or the kill zone becomes less. And again, it is somewhat dependent also on how aggressive or competitive some of the grasses are as well. Alfalfa tends to be what we find gives us the best bang for the buck at this time. It seems to be, well, first off, it's probably one of the cheaper seeds compared to some of the natives, and we also see that it can really perform under some of the drier conditions, and to some extent that is due to its rooting capabilities. After all, alfalfa has been noted in the Nebraska sandhills to take and go down to 28 feet. We have measured roots down to 15 feet in Swift Current itself. And for seeding rates, this is the question we often get, and this seeding rate is very dependent on how much of your stand that you want to eliminate and put alfalfa in. Some people are very comfortable with 100% alfalfa, in which case you would use the recommended standard seeding rate to take and replace the entire herbicide-killed pasture into alfalfa. But there's also a much larger proportion that aren't that willing to take and do 100% alfalfa, in which case they start looking at percentages of alfalfa within the stand so that depends on how many strips you're going to be placing. In which case we then go to something like what we did was 100 pure live seeds per meter, and just calculate that out as based on what percentage of the land that you're using with the kill zone. And the thing to note here, what we did find in our own plots, even though we had 100 pure live seeds per meter, we didn't get 100 plants per meter. We actually got something closer to about 11%, and that 11% actually filled in within 2 years and gave us a solid stand of alfalfa within that row. Anyways, so that's what worked at Swift Current under our dry conditions. So in summary then, what we're looking at, the points I'm hoping to have gotten across to you, and at least give you some food for thought, is you need to understand what the goal is. Are you looking at production? And is that production aimed at hay or cattle grazing, or even wildlife habitat? Each of these you need to take a look at a slightly different approach to what you want to do. And again, that approach includes selecting the appropriate species. And again, diversifying the stand. Again, you have to understand, or you have to know, or have a good idea how you want to diversify that stand. Do you want to increase the grass component? Do you want to increase the legumes, or do you want more than one legume? That type of thing. So you have to get your mind around what type of stand you want to look at. Diversifying is definitely I believe the way to go to take and reduce your risks. And you also need to understand the limitations of the site. Are you dealing with light soils? Light soils, I would in my opinion, you want to really restrict sort of removal of a lot of the vegetation, just to take and decrease the risk of erosion. And heavier soils, you have to be conscious about how that plant, the seedlings are going to be able to penetrate the clay, the heavier soil clays. And also that limited, are you in an area where the precipitation is limited? And again, that will definitely affect maybe some of it as to how you're going to take and do your rejuvenation. As we've seen, Swift Current being in a semi-arid environment, sod seeding seems to work quite well. You need to select a method that works for the operation with the limitations in mind. And again, this comes down to what are you willing to risk, and also what is going to be the biggest benefit to your operation. And because at the end of the day, what it comes down to is economics. Are you going to be able to take and make this work economically for you? You need to create that safe site for the seedlings. Without that safe site, the seedlings just, they may germinate, but you won't get the stand that you need or desire. Sod seeding is but one method of the rejuvenation. Again, it's the one that seems to have worked at Swift Current the best. If sod seeding is selected, determine the prescription for your operation. Basically, how much of that stand do you want to replace, and which then amounts to how much of the herbicide you're going to need and how you're going to take and put those strips out there. And by the way, putting the strips out there is not that difficult. We've done it by just knocking out every second or third nozzle on a sprayer and then spraying out. And you get your strips, you adjust the height so that you get the width you want. And then as far as seeding into those slots, again, it's a matter of lining up the seeder and blocking off your openers that aren't and do not occur within the sprayed strips. And I guess I'm saying it's not that difficult. I'm a person that hasn't had a lot of tractor experience, but I was able to take and hit the rows my first attempt. So with anybody experienced, I would imagine it should be something that should be able to be achieved. And I guess one of the key points is, in some situations, the reason you're looking at rejuvenation is because some of the management decisions have occurred where possibly overgrazing has occurred, or application of a herbicide has removed species that you wanted to keep. You need to take and adjust those management strategies such that those conditions don't occur again. Otherwise, you're going to be repeating this entire effort in a much shorter time span or cycle than you maybe want to be doing. And with that, I guess that's the end of my presentation. I'm open to take questions at this time.
All right, perfect. So if you do have any questions, I'll remind you that you can type them into the chat window on the side of your screen, and I will read them out loud. And as I said, your questions will be anonymous as well here. But before we get into that, I will launch our last poll question here. So would you implement any of the strategies described in this presentation? So not at all, somewhat likely, you're likely to, or you're very likely. Just give you a few more minutes here, a few more seconds. All right. So it looks like we're all in that somewhat likely, not, or likely or very likely. So about 41% say they were somewhat going to, 32% say they're likely to, and 27% say that they are very likely to. All right. So with that, we will turn it over to questions. As I mentioned, you're more than welcome, or please write your questions into the chat box on the side of your window. We do have a few that have been submitted ahead of time here. So I will start with those. So one of the first one here is, has frost seeding or broadcasting seeds onto frozen ground been tried for alfalfa?
Yes, that has. We have done that. Alfalfa is actually one of the species that seems to do well with the frost seeding. With the frost seeding, we tend not to scarify the seed. We let Mother Nature do the scarification over the winter with the alternating temperatures. And as I said earlier, one of the advantages of frost seeding is it does give you that access to that spring moisture earlier. There is a risk involved, though, because if you do get a year such as we've had this year, you will have had some of that seed germinating over the winter, and then experiencing the below zero temperatures, and as a result, the seedlings will have died out due to freezing.
All right, thank you very much. So you talked about the yellow blossom alfalfa developed at Swift Current. Can you talk about if this has a high bloat risk?
It is a species that the bloat was not decreased in it. The advantage of the AC yellowhead is that it is a grazing persistent alfalfa. It's what we call a falcata. And so it's slower to respond to being grazed, where some of the other varieties, one of the reasons they get grazed out is because they animals go in, they graze it, and then it immediately initiates regrowth, and the animals keep coming back and keep grazing it. As a result, the roots get exhausted, and the plant dies. Now, the bloat thing, can be managed by watching the plants and making sure that your plants aren't at that stage where they are at their highest digestibility. And one of the keys is also to take and be careful that you don't have a lot of dew present on your leaf material, such that which encourages the more rapid digestion as well.
All right, thank you. So our next question here, what are some recommendations for rejuvenating during a drought year? Are there any precautions that should be taken?
The biggest one would be that you should have done the rejuvenation before the drought year. Drought year, the biggest issue tends to be is getting those seedlings up, and if there is insufficient moisture for those seedlings to actually emerge and develop the roots, it doesn't matter what you're going to do, you won't. If you apply the fertilizer, the fertilizer will basically sit there. It doesn't get absorbed into the roots. It just sits there because it needs that moisture to move down into the soil, but you're going to be broadcasting typically for the fertilizer. What else? So, the advantage, I guess, what we found with the sod seeding in a droughty area that we are working in is the fact you did not lose complete productivity. You still had the grass present that you could go in and graze if your alfalfa did not emerge or germinate. You still had access to some of that forage that you would have had in the field.
All right. Another question here, have you done any rejuvenation testing with Mountain View Sandfoin?
Not with Mountain View, not with Mountain View specifically. We have done in the past with Nova. We tended to find with the sod seeding itself, the Sandfoin didn't work that well. It's not a strong competitor typically.
Okay. So I'm just going to ask a couple more questions here. We've got a lot coming in, but we're just over our time already here. So I'll ask you a couple more. One here, how do you get nitrogen fertilizer into the soil in a dry climate?
What we've, like I say, we typically have done the broadcast. We broadcast, and then you basically hope for rain to take and move that into the soil. Now, what you could also try side banding into your sod. Again, the key here is that you still have to have moisture. If you don't have the moisture, you don't get that movement of the nitrogen into the soil, and it really is of no benefit a year of application. Now, with any luck, it doesn't evaporate out on you and or volatilize, and the following year, if you get moisture in the following year, the fertilizer you applied the previous year would then move into the soil, and you'd get the effect that you're looking for, but not the year of application.
Okay. Another one here. Would you recommend seeding alfalfa and milk vetch together in boosting production on an old stand of fairway crested wheatgrass?
I'm going to assume that the milk vetch they're talking about is Sicer. As I said, it comes down to where the individual is located. The milk vetch, as we have found, you need that moist environment for that plant to establish. It just seems to prefer a moisture environment. It's not. The other thing is, once you have it established in a drought year, you have to be cautious as to how you utilize it, because if you do cut it in a drought year, it disappears. It doesn't come back in that year. With any luck, it'll come back the following year, but it usually comes back as a weaker stand. So, you can combine it, and if you're in the right environment where you have that moisture, Sicer milk vetch and alfalfa is a really nice combination.
All right. So one more question for you here. I realize there's a lot more, but just as we're short on time. So has there been any research done with Sandfoin in interseeding?
I believe there are some projects underway. I know there's a couple at Swift Current where they're looking at different means of seeding Sandfoin. I guess my question, and probably won't be answered, but is what are they interseeding it with? Are they interseeding it just into a grass, or are they interseeding into alfalfa? Because there is work done in Lethbridge where they have put sandfoin into alfalfa stands to decrease bloat.
And I don't have any further information, but
yeah.
All right, so we're going to close the questions off there. Like I said, I realize a lot of you still have questions for us here, but just in terms of time. And so I just have a few closing remarks for you. So I would encourage you to check out both the Beef Cattle Research Council and AAFC websites for more information. So there will especially any of you that had further questions, and to also sign up for our email list where you can get up-to-date information as well. If you have Twitter, Facebook, or YouTube's accounts, you can connect with us there as well. So as soon as the webinar ends, you'll be asked to complete a short survey that asks about tonight's session and what you're most interested in for future webinar topics. We do need your feedback to do the best job we can to deliver information that's both useful and meaningful to your operation. So please complete that survey for us, and don't hesitate to contact me with any questions, comments, or concerns or suggestions that you have at any time. You're also going to receive an email from me within the next couple of days with a link to watch the recording, as well as some additional information on forage rejuvenation as well that you can get from that. Don't miss our next webinars. So our next one coming up will be next week, a week from today actually, and it will be on antimicrobial use and resistance in beef cattle and kind of what producers need to know. It'll be a very good talk. And also Mike today talked about some of the newer forage varieties that have been developed through Ag Canada, and our webinar on March 23rd will also be once again held in conjunction with Ag Canada, and we will be talking about new forage varieties. So make sure you join us for that as well. So that's all I have for today. So I want to thank all of you at home for joining us tonight. And on behalf of everyone, I would like to thank Mike for volunteering your time and expertise tonight. So thank you and good night.